Welcome. My name is Peter Tanella. I'm a partner at Mandelbaum Barrett. I'm on behalf of the panelists. I want to welcome you all here tonight. Got an exciting panel. A lot of information is going to be shared. Before we get started, I just want to go over some housekeeping items. I want to first thank our sponsors. We have Chris Husselman from Provide Bank. Chris, where are you? Over here, Chris. For those of you who don't know, Provide is a subsidiary of Fifth Third Bank. They're a leader in tech-enabled financial services for small business owners, specializing in financing for healthcare professionals. Provide offers industry expertise, customized financial products, and personalized service to help entrepreneurs achieve ownership and financial independence. We also have Dominic Lobafaro from LLI Advisory Group over here. Dominic reminded me, I think I've known Dominic probably 20 years now. I'm getting a little long in the tooth on my end over here. LLI provides specialized accounting, tax, and advisory services for dental and healthcare professionals. With decades of experience, LLI helps practice owners navigate daily operations, transitions, and long-term growth with expert financial guidance. I also want to recognize some of our team members over here, Katie, Ida, and Aaron, for helping us put this seminar together. They've been working hard all afternoon. You'll see on your tables there is a hashtag. If you guys would just take a moment and scan that in, there's a survey that's going to come up at the end of the seminar. We really want to be able to get your feedback when we're done here. I'm filling in for my partner, Bill Barrett. Bill wanted to be here, but unfortunately had a personal conflict. So I'm the substitute. Hopefully I live up to his standard. I want us to introduce our panel. So I'm going to start with Mark on my left. Mark Murphy is the CEO of a Northeast Sequoia Private Client Group, a national financial planning and wealth management firm.
Nobody cares, Pete.
No? You don't want me to do that? I had longer ones. You want me to do that? Okay. Okay.
If my mother was here, I would ask you to do it.
All right. Okay, good. All right. Well, my partner, Casey Gocel, is the co-chair of our firm's dental practice group. We have Dr. Jason Auerbach, and we have Dr. Robert Sorin, and we have Michele Gabriel from DDS Match. So there's our panel. Short and sweet. The idea of tonight's the panel discussion is really to be interactive. You guys have the experts in the industry. Ask questions. That's what they're here for. I'm going to kick it off with a couple questions for them, but we really want to hear from you while you have them in the room. And I wanted to start with Michele. We're here at an exit strategy seminar. So Michele, tell me, when should a doctor reach out to you when considering selling their practice?
So, for me, it's a matter of let's start a conversation, right? So, having been partners with doctors at every phase of their career, there's never too early to start having that conversation. So whether or not you're 5, 7, 10 years out, if you're far enough out, we can take a look at the business and say, okay, what are some things that can help leverage the business that you're currently in to help it grow? And we also have to take a look at, putting things in place. Where is your house in order? And your house can be your personal life, but also your professional life. So we want to look at each different department within your personal and professional life and have enough time for us to really take a look at it. Once we get in that 3-year mark, you're not really going to see the impact to your revenue and your business by implementing those strategies. So the further we can get ahead of that, the more that we can be prepared, the more we can take a look at some intricacies and have a conversation about how do I get prepared for when the time comes, because then you can help to transition on your terms and you're in the driver's seat for all of that, for sure.
And Casey, just following up on that, what should I be doing if I'm going to prepare for a future sale, in your experience?
Well, we hear from our clients at all sorts of different timelines. Sometimes people call us and say, okay, I want to retire tomorrow. What do I have to do? And sometimes, like Michele was saying, we'll hear people years in advance thinking about their exit strategy and what should we do to get prepared. So like every lawyer, I'll answer that question with an it depends. It depends on the situation that we're in. But most of the time, there's an opportunity to really add value to your practice before you actually list it for sale, or think about having an associate buy, or a local practitioner buy. So we do things like take a look at if you have an associate, are you classifying them properly? Do you have independent contractors in your practice, and are you properly classifying them as independent contractors versus W-2? Just by a show of hands, who in this room has an associate that works for them? Okay. Are any of you classifying them as independent contractors? Right. So in almost every case, that's not permissible under the law. So we take a look at that and properly classify, or help you properly classify them, because when a buyer comes in, they're going to knock down your purchase price based on the fact that they're going to have to reclassify them because there's risk and they're not going to inherit that risk. So that's one thing that we like to do. But there's a lot of other things that we can do to sort of, quote unquote, get your house in order. The one thing I would say you should all go do tonight, Google yourself. Like, not right this second, but like maybe when we're done. Google yourself, Google your practice, and see what comes up, because your future buyer is going to do it.
That's right.
And so if your social media presence looks like parties and things that you don't really want to be associated with your professional life, start cleaning it up now, because a potential buyer, whether it's a private practitioner or a DSO in the future, is definitely going to. So there's all sorts of strategies that we have, like a little bit of an internal list, and I'm sure Michele does too, as a practice broker. But there's all sorts of things that we can do ahead of the sale to actually increase the value of your practice. And we'll kind of like walk you through those stages depending on how much time we have between your potential liquidity event and the day that we start the process.
Mark, you hear about planning, for a process and cleaning up your house. What are you advising your clients?
Well, first thing I would say is, when you say go Google yourself, is that a euphemism for another word? I didn't know.
Actually, the new term apparently my daughter would call search it up. We don't say Google anymore.
I would just say everybody has two businesses. Everyone starts with the cash flow business. When you all start, you need to have a business that's cash flow, so you can pay all your bills, you can have your lifestyle, you can do what you want. But everybody also has another business, and it's called I wish I had this business that they built. And depending on your time frame, the idea is that what I see with people is that whether you have a short time frame because you're getting prepared for sale, or you've got a long time frame, how do you sit back and create enough EBITDA in that business? Because if you're going to sell, if a business will sell for somewhere between 5 and 8 or 9 times EBITDA, depending on the year or what's there, for every $100,000 of EBITDA you can create, that's another, let's call it $800,000 of revenue on the sale. And I think that the thing that people have to realize is that a lot of people who are entrepreneurs, they live out of their corporate checkbook. And so they're used to expensing their lives out of their business. They're looking at tax advantage things to be able to go do that. And I think that sometimes the shock that comes in place is they think, oh, if I retire, I can replace the amount of income I show on a W-2. But they're not taking into account the tax effect. They're not taking into account the money that they're stealing out of their corporate checkbook. And so I think that ultimately what you have to do is to account for that. And I think you've got to do that before you sell. And especially if you have even a year or two, there's a lot you can do in the short term to go to that business that I wish I had.
Now, you said a year or two. I'll throw it out to the panel. Mm-hmm. When should you start planning? Whoever wants to answer.
Yeah. So I would say, transition planning and transitioning are two totally different things, right? So when we're thinking about transition planning, we're thinking about what are the steps in the process in order to get myself prepared for the eventual sale of my practice, which is actually the going to market portion. So transition planning, again, going back to that 3 or 5 year conversation, dependent upon, again, what you're running through the business and really what that looks like. I mean, we like to call them perks, right? So everybody has a lot of perks that are built into their business. But what we're trying to do is look for the story behind your practice. And looking back at that 3 year trend, one thing I would honestly say is just make sure you don't take your foot off the gas, right? So when we're looking at that 3 year trend, if we're sitting down and we're 3 and 5 years out and we're having a conversation and you want to start to take longer vacations or start peel away days, let's at least have a plan with an associate placement or some kind of alternative already in place before you start to make those changes. Because I can speak for the lenders and I can also speak for the buyers in reference to when those things start to trend down, it's going to have a real effect to the value of your practice. So let's make sure we talk about that ahead of time.
Dr. Auerbach and Dr. Sorin, for two doctors who went through this process, you're hearing these timeframes. When did you start thinking about transitioning?
I probably started thinking about transitioning, I would say 3 years before.
3 years.
I mean, my answer to that would be it's never too early. You really have to think about the fact that when DSOs or private equity or any potential buyer is looking at your practice, they're looking at your TTM, your trailing 12, so the last 12 months for sure, but they're looking at it in the context of a longer trend. You have to consider where you need to get your practice from a viability perspective well before you really think that you do. And I find that a lot of people invest a lot into the infrastructure of the practice, not realizing that in terms of total enterprise value, it's going to end up costing you. So, you look at the end game, you think about where you want to be at whatever time period, and you reverse engineer. But it's never too early to start thinking about how you're going to set yourself up for the next step.
What about, and just staying on with you, Dr. Auerbach, we were talking about it earlier while we're eating. You went from one location up to eventually you went to 11 locations before you ended up transitioning. How did that process? What was your your thought process, your mindset, in terms of that growth, and how did that look?
Yeah, so I started my practice in 2007 out of that guy Marlon's office. I was renting space from him, and we were in northern New Jersey with really one goal, which was to build what I thought was an exceptional oral surgery practice. We eventually ended up acquiring practices on our periphery of where we existed based on our reputation, based on our belief that we were providing the best care. And over the course of about, 13, 14 years, we acquired a total of 10 or 11 practices. We did that with the help of that guy over there, Dominic Lobafaro from LLI, who was there with me from the beginning, which is crazy, and Casey, which is a funny story. So basically, Riverside Oral Surgery became a pretty strong brand in New Jersey, and if people were thinking about investing in specialty dentistry in New Jersey, they were often talking to us. I knew I didn't want to sell to certain types of DSOs. I certainly didn't want to be just kind of a piece of a puzzle. I thought that I had more to bring, so we set out and found investors. And for us, that was really the key for me to become, the co-CEO and founder of a platform has been transformative in a ton of ways. And I'm so happy I did it the way that I did it. But everybody's got their own story. Everybody's got what needs to understand what matters to them. I think the most important thing is to kind of think about what your life looks like after whatever transition you decide to go through and find the right fit. And I think that when you have, people who are working on your behalf, that's got to be part of the process as well, not just the highest bidder, but who's the right fit.
Jason, I don't believe in competition. I believe in differentiation. And I think that nobody did that better than you. I mean, just the fact that you're known throughout the country as the bloody tooth guy, that wasn't the only thing you did, but it differentiated you from every other oral surgeon in the country, much less in New Jersey. And so I think that, the public doesn't know who's a good surgeon or who's not. They have no idea. And so all of those things that you did to differentiate yourself from everybody else was what created the value in your business, in my opinion.
I appreciate that. Yeah, I mean, you were talking about two different businesses. I think there's a third, which is, your personal brand, which has so much to do with, how you portray yourself out there for everyone to see. And in this world where social media is so integral in terms of developing a following and can be instrumental in becoming, pretty successful, it's important to understand that your reputation follows you everywhere. And that's why we talk about always doing the right thing and just kind of always putting yourself out there in the best light. So I appreciate what you're saying, but that's a huge part of what we do. Thank you.
Mark, when you're talking about Jason, who's scaled from 1 to 11 locations. When you're meeting with your clients, are you talking to them about that in terms of, what's appropriate or when they should take advantage of that?
I would say two things. I think, what we want to do is we want to help everybody. Unlike I'm an NFL registered player financial advisor, do a lot in sports and entertainment. And those people have 3.5-year contracts with no guaranteed contracts. In dentistry, you have 20, 30, 40-year careers. With any sort of, good luck, everybody in this room should create multi-generational wealth and a life by design. And so few people do that. Very few people, some really smart people who just haven't gotten that figured out. And I used to think creating multi-generational wealth was enough. That was always the epitome. But then I thought, well, hey, that's not enough. Because if your spouse hates you, if your kids hate you, if you're unhealthy, if you're miserable, who cares if you have all the money in the world? So you want to create not only multi-generational wealth, but a life by design, a life that's so great that you go from one thing you love, you aspire to go from one thing you love to something you love more to something you love more than that, so that you try to create a life that not only you never have to retire from, you don't even have to take a vacation from. And if you got those two things, that's really, really powerful. And then I would say the other thing that I've probably been asked 10,000 times in some form or another is people will say, how do I grow my income? How do I grow my business? How do I grow my freedom of time? How do I grow my freedom of relationships to spend more time with the people I choose to? How do I grow my freedom of purpose to have a purposeful life? And each of us in this room is one person, and I always thought that was the wrong question and very daunting. I thought the right question always was, who do we need to collaborate with to grow our income, our business, our freedom of time, relationship, and purpose? And if you collaborate with people that want to be a hero to the same group, that's how you grow a business, not 1 or 2 or 3x, but how you do what Jason did and grow at 5x or 10x or 50x by collaborating with the right people. Yeah, clearly. And that's been our business for years. If you want to differentiate, like I would ask everybody in this room, there's a lot of people that are either in your specialty, whether you're a specialist or a GP. And so the public doesn't know, other than your location is in their town or not there. But how are you going to, I think the aspirational piece would be to sit down and say, why would anyone want to come to your practice? And what you should aspire, I say, to play in a competition-free zone where the only place that patient could get that experience, or the best people who want to work for your practice could get that experience, is by coming to your practice. That's where I think you need to go, and that's where money's invested. In fact, we don't manage millions of dollars, we manage billions of dollars. But if you only had $1 to invest, the best place any entrepreneur invests is when they invest in themselves. And clearly, I don't know Dr. Sorin well, but I know what Jason's done, and investing in Jason's worked out okay, Jason.
Dr. Sorin, Mark mentioned you. I had a question. As someone who has sold the practice and now works as a senior associate, how is your perspective on ownership versus employment evolved? How has your perspective on ownership versus working as a senior associate? What's your perspective on that? What's your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that depends where you are in your career. For me, I think I had reached the point where I was looking to turn over some responsibility that I didn't want to deal with anymore. But I think that you need to be ready to make that transition, because once you make that commitment to sell your practice, you're no longer in control of certain parts of your destiny. So I think for me it worked out fine, because I was compatible with the two partners who purchased my practice. They kind of let me alone so I could just continue to do the kind of practice that I was doing before. And I think you have to be psychologically ready, and you have to understand that the power is no longer in your hands.
Did you talk with them about that ahead of time in terms of how they would allow you to continue to practice post-closing? Did you guys have conversations about that?
We did not.
You didn't?
And I think that falls under the category of you don't know what you don't know.
Mm-hmm. Right.
I think I was fortunate because I came from a totally fee-for-service kind of environment. They were a totally fee-for-service environment also, but, the fact remains the patients are no longer yours. So, if a large restorative case comes in or a large cosmetic case comes in, they had the right to say, hey, I think we're going to do that case, you're not going to do it. But in my situation, that just wasn't the case. So I think it's really important to understand the personalities of who you're going to be working with and for, before you make that leap. I mean, you can. I kind of knew that the people who purchased my practice, I knew by reputation. We met a significant number of times before we finally closed the deal. But you still, it's still an unknown until day one or day 20 or day 365, because you don't always know the personalities that you're dealing with.
Can I just interject?
Yeah, please.
Dr. Sorin, why don't you talk a little about kind of the specifics of that transition, like what actually changed when you no longer were in charge, and did they keep, the staff the same? And I know you had a 3-year term that you recently opted to renew. So why don't you talk a little bit about that?
All right. So, I mean, just as introduction, I was a solo practitioner who practiced in Midtown Manhattan for over 30 years. My lease was up, or my lease was coming up. And I had a landlord who was a bit of a jerk, as many of you in the city know. They tend to be jerks. So I was looking for another opportunity, and I really didn't want to renew for an extended period of time. So to address your point, we had a number of conversations about how we were going to transact the buy and the sell, and I was able to take with me a really key employee who started as my assistant, eventually became my office manager, and I took a hygienist who had worked for me for over 20 years. So, I was fortunate in the sense, as I said before, that they really didn't bother me. I just continued to practice the kind of dentistry that I practiced before. So we did have some discussion about how that transition was going to go in terms of staffing. And they've been very courteous to me in terms of quality of staff that work with me. I've been fortunate that, they don't put me with inexperienced people, and I feel fortunate that I've been able to practice at the same level that I practiced before I did the transition. And yes, we did have a 3-year. We had a 3-year buyout. Most of the money I got up front. Some of it was delayed over a 3-year period of time. We had a 3-year work period. I just resigned for another year. And I must say I consider myself to be pretty fortunate because I really like and respect the people that I'm working with. And I think they feel the same about me.
Mark, I think that's to your point where you're saying, you really love what you do. You sold, you had a 3-year term, and you could have just walked away, but obviously you like the culture of the practice, and you love what you do. So it's probably not like you're going to work.
Well, it's some days it's more fun than when I did it on my own.
Right.
I'd like to interject on that too, because when we talk about that transition planning and that timing, I jokingly say we're not a dating service, but we kind of are, right? I mean, we're really looking for that match for you. And so, we're only seller side service, but I spend a great deal of time making sure that buyers are educated about the opportunity, that they have the right tools, the right information, that we're meeting. And the longer for somebody that they can get ahead of that and us have a conversation, I don't pick who they sell their practice to. I represent the sellers. But ultimately, it's us having a conversation and sitting down and talking about, who's the best fit for your practice. What does the transition strategy look like? What's the expectation of how long you're going to stay on? We want to make sure that all those stars are aligned, and we want to get ahead of that conversation. We don't want to get to a point where we're so far into the transition that the expectations aren't being met by both parties or we miss something. So, that's part of the process in walking through not only the preparation of your personal life and your practice, but also us sitting down and having a conversation and saying, okay, post-transition, what are some of your goals and what does that look like for you?
Can any of you address, that post-transition phase in terms of how long you're staying on for people, whether you're selling independently or you're selling to a DSO? What's the expectation there?
Yeah.
I can
start.
take that,
You can
sure.
start, yeah.
And I'm sure we all have perspective on it.
Yeah.
Anyone who would be transacting from a buy-side perspective obviously would like a longer-term commitment than just a couple of years, I think, to make the investment and therefore pay a multiple on your profitability, which is how the value is determined, is going to expect and hope and want either some sort of transition plan for you and your patients, or for you to actually stay on. That's why I kind of highlight this concept of you can never start planning too early, and you really need to identify for yourselves what's important to you and what your post-deal life looks like. Be able to articulate that and do all the due diligence on your side, because you can be absolutely sure that the buyer, the acquirer, the partner is going to be doing a ton of due diligence on you and your practice, both from a financial and also a qualitative perspective. So it really is incumbent upon you as the practitioner, someone who's going to basically leave your legacy to this next platform, to do your research, to understand who it is that you're getting involved with, because ultimately it's we talk about it's like a marriage, whatever. I mean, the fact of the matter is it's significant. That relationship is defining. You go to work every single day. You have to be confident that you made the right decision. Not that every day is a perfect day, but you have to really understand that now you're working in a slightly different environment. You want it to be as similar, hopefully better, than the environment you were working in when every call was your own, that there is a relief of responsibility, but also that there are benefits that you're deriving in addition to that. So it's really all about the relationship. It's like, brokers, investment bankers, there are many, many different ones. DSOs, there are many, many different ones. There are different dentists out there. The fact is you just kind of need to know who you're dealing with.
Mark, you were going to say, just real quick, post-deal life look like? What does it look like? What are you talking with your clients about that?
I always believe it's the post-transition deal is not just about money. It's psychological too. That I think for a lot of people in life, there's no finish lines. There's only milestones, and that's a milestone when you sell your practice. But for a lot of people, the teamwork stops, the applause stops. You're no longer doctor anymore. There's a lot of things that change on that piece, and I think that people have to be prepared financially, but they also have to be prepared emotionally when they leave, because that is a shocking piece. And I think that I would tell somebody not to walk away, not necessarily not to sell, but not to walk away until they've got something that they love more than what they were doing currently, because there's nothing sadder than we live in Palm Beach for half of the winter. And you got half the people who are down there said, I should have retired 10 years earlier. This is like, it's like, summer camp for senior citizens, and they love it. And the other half are saying, I used to have 8,000 people report to me, and now I go to the dry cleaner and make dinner reservations. And they're miserable in their lives. I think the rule that we always say is your future always has to be bigger than your past. It doesn't mean you have to be a chairside doctor. But I think one of the keys to a successful retirement is money, but it's also that your future must be bigger than your past.
Casey, just staying on this theme, let's stay on with DSOs. Obviously, there's going to be some type of requirement if you're going to sell to a DSO for you to stay on and work. What about equity? If the buyer wants, for you as a seller to retain equity in the practice, is that a good idea, bad idea? What's your thoughts on that? What do you advise your clients about?
Well, let me go back and talk a little bit about the staying on thing for a second, because again, the lawyer answer, it depends. Everything that Jason said is correct, but he also founded a DSO, so he runs an oral surgery specific dental practice organization. But what a solo practitioner who's looking to sell to another solo practitioner may have a very different path, especially if they're a general dentist. And so I just want to sort of caveat the fact that there are opportunities out there for, especially in the general dentistry industry, but even for specialists, to find private buyers that aren't going to require such a long transition period. When it comes to DSO transactions, you will be hard-pressed to find a DSO that will purchase your practice and let you have a shorter transition period than 5 years. You're going to have a 5-year minimum requirement employment agreement. No question asked whether you're a GP or a specialist. However, if you're doing a doctor-to-doctor transaction, you may be a solo person selling to another solo person, and they just want you to stay on for one hygiene cycle and then get out of there so that they can be in the practice, because maybe there's not enough space. Maybe it's a 3 or 4 op practice, and there's not really a space for 2 general dentists to be in there, or even enough patients to be seen. So, on the doctor-to-doctor sale, the transition period can be a lot shorter. But I will say that if you happen to be a specialist, any specialist, the transition is always going to be longer, because to Jason's point, the goodwill component transitions with you. And if you are a referral-based business, like any specialist organization is going to be, they're going to want you to stay on long enough to actually be able to gather the goodwill and the relationship with those referral sources. So there are going to be requirements not only for you to continue practicing in your specialty, but also for you to help transition those relationships. And that means going out to dinner or doing whatever it was you were doing before to kind of build rapport with those referral relationships. So I just want to kind of mention that, because I know we have a lot of solo people in the audience today who may be thinking, I wanted to sell tomorrow and definitely don't want to stay for 5 years. So there are opportunities, but you're probably not looking at a DSO transaction. As for the equity question, almost every DSO out there is going to require equity. When COVID hit and we ended up with this massive influx of DSOs and startup DSOs in our market, it really changed the structure of how DSO transactions take place. Always a 5-year employment agreement, always, and pretty much always rollover equity. The lowest you'll see is 20%, and it's very rare. It's more common to be 30 or even 40% rollover equity. So what do I mean by that? If somebody comes into your organization and they say, I'm going to pay you a purchase price of $1 million, you're likely going to get about $700,000 of cash, and you're going to get 30% of rollover equity, which means continued ownership in the management company that manages your practice. So when profits come out of that practice, you will continue to be entitled to 30% of those. And what does that do? It creates a thing called golden handcuffs. If you own part of the business, you're not going to leave. And DSOs can't run a dental practice. They actually don't know anything about dentistry, believe it or not. And so they need doctors. They need you, and you are the goodwill. And a goodwill allocation to any purchase price in any DSO transaction is 90%. Which means 90% of the money that they're giving you is based on your reputation, which means if you leave, it's worth basically nothing. So they tie you in with this long-term employment agreement, and they tie you in with restrictive covenants, and they tie you in with rollover equity. Is it a good idea? Sure, why not? But it kind of depends on the size of the DSO. It depends on how young they are, how old they are, what their reputation is. I always tell my clients, it's like buying stock in Apple. If you had bought stock in Apple back in the 90s or whenever it was that it was worth like $1, that would have been a really, really, really good investment. Investing in Apple right now, I don't know, maybe, and it's very expensive, right? And so when you're investing and having rollover equity in a young DSO that's just starting, you're buying early stock in Apple. When you're buying equity or getting equity as a rollover as part of your consideration for your deal, and you're getting it in a well-established DSO that's already recapped and gone to private equity and all that, it's like buying, investing in Apple now. So, you really have to do the analysis, and that's why it's so important to have people like Mark and his team on your side, because as your lawyer, I can help you negotiate the best deal. But if your rollover equity is going to turn to worth nothing, like what happened with NADG, then you have to have a backup plan. And so you need somebody to analyze the success work stream and the not so successful work stream and see, can you really afford to do this transaction? And that's kind of where Mark and his team step in, because I'm most definitely not a financial person.
I would just make one comment that I think is universal, whether you're a dental student, like the 2 guys in the front row, or you're ready to get out, is kind of the rule of thumb that I would have would be, we like our doctors to get paid 4 ways. We want them to get paid as the landlord if possible. We'd like them to get paid as the doctor. We'd also like them to get paid as the CEO and the owner of the business. And the expression we have is, after you get paid as the doctor and the landlord, if you're not putting a minimum, and I mean a minimum of 20% to the bottom line, you don't have a business, you bought yourself a job. And many of the best practices in this room are putting 30 and 35 and 40% to the bottom line after they get paid as the doctor. Meaning that if you did $1 million of dentistry with your own hands, and let's say you were a GP and we use 33%, let's say, that means you'd have to take out a salary of $333,000 And if you made $533,000, that means your profit was $200,000. And so it has to be a minimum of that to go do that. And I think the other thing is with inflation and what's happened to salaries, the other thing that's hurt the profitability is the other thing that people have to do is they have to win the war for talent. That is, to me, become so critical in this environment, in this inflationary environment, where there's a zero unemployment in dentistry. Anybody who wants to be in dentistry can get a job. And that doesn't mean they're all good. It just means there's zero unemployment, so there's that folks that's there. And so part of that thing is people think, they always say, how do I grow my business? And my comment is you don't really grow a business, you grow people, and you invest in people. And it's not about money. You have to pay competitively, but you shouldn't pay the most. And the reason for that is because if you'll come to work for me for $1, that means you'll leave if somebody else pays them $1 more. And I think that basically the overarm is you want to have two things. When people are learning and growing, they don't leave. And the second thing is you have to create the right culture. And the one thing the CEO or the owner and the doctor of the business, they can delegate everything. I love to delegate as many things as I can. But the one thing you can never delegate in your office is your culture. And so I think if you have both of those right, and we have a system in place, so as an example, not to be too long-winded, but if you come into my organization, in the first 2 years, we want you to just get great at your job. We want to show you a great job looks. But once you're there a couple of years, we want you to start to mentor the newbies. Because the best way to learn a subject at a deep level is to teach it to somebody else. But then after you're there for 4 or 5 years, you want everybody in your organization, or certainly your leadership, to be a subject matter expert on something. And it doesn't have to be technical, it doesn't have to be specific, there's lots of different ways they can do it. But ultimately, to me, that's one of the keys that I'm seeing when I see an office that doesn't have great results, is that they have not won the war for talent. Or the reverse, when they're great at that, they got income tax problems.
Yeah, right. I'm just to throw a question out to the group here. Anybody can answer. What are some of the biggest challenges you see as practice owners make when they're looking to sell their practice? Anyone?
Yeah, I certainly, to dovetail on Mark's positioning, a lot of things in post-COVID certainly have changed, especially in a lot of dental practices, kind of how they acquire talent, how they retain talent, what their culture looks like. I think also, some of the challenges or the shifting business models. So some of the overhead and maybe the profitability of the practice has changed significantly over the years. I think the other component is, of course, dental insurance, right? Whether or not doctors are participating with certain plans. When we're looking at the business, what does that do to the profitability? How much of it is your patient base? So I think some of the challenges, not only for a doctor that's trying to sell, but also for a buyer to understand the full picture of what the opportunity is. I think a lot of that has changed, and some of those challenges can be, if they've had a lot of turnover in the office, or if they've had somebody that's left recently. We are all about the transparency through the transition. And so part of that might happen in the middle of us doing a transition, right? Where, there might be a hygienist that left or a key component in the practice that's now exited the practice. But going back to Mark's point, when you have a good culture in a practice and you have, a good family environment, and you're able to explain that to a potential buyer for the longevity of the team. And I think some of the other things are too is on the flip side of things, if you have a more seasoned staff, and some of those challenges might be, maybe your compensation for those legacy staff members are also maybe above the market range. And so some of those things can be challenges in reference to the cash flow. So I think when we think about challenges, again, it's a matter of just sitting down and having a conversation and saying, okay, what does the practice look like for you? And what does the practice look like for a potential buyer that may be coming in? And then if we have enough time, then we can have some discussions on about what are some of those rungs on the ladder or spokes in the wheel that we kind of need to put into place to make sure that you're in a better position and have to deal with less challenges when you're ready to transition.
Yeah, Dr. Sorin, please.
So answering that question about what's the biggest challenge, again, I'm coming at this from a solo practitioner's point of view. And I think the biggest challenge is finding a culture that works for you. And as some of the other speakers have already alluded to, I think that depends what's most important for you. So If it's only about the money and you don't care about how you're going to practice or whether you want to stay, that's one thing. But speaking from personal experience, I wanted an environment that was going to be comforting for me. So I think you need to spend time trying to understand where it is you're going to be and what your life is going to be like on a day-to-day basis. So when I went to sell my practice, I actually had an offer from a DSO, and they wanted to move me into somebody else's office. It was people I was familiar with, but I just didn't get a comfortable vibration and decided it wasn't a place that I wanted to be. I was fortunate enough to find two practitioners across the street from me who were more than happy to have me move into their space. I don't think I have to tell you, when you move your space into an existing facility, a lot of their fixed costs remain the same, even though their variable costs may be altered slightly. But I just got a good feel from the personalities of the doctors who were purchasing my practice. And another thing that I think was really important that I don't think I fully understood at the time was the people who purchased my practice, they were already busy. They didn't need my productivity. They didn't really need my collection. So it wasn't like they were pulling all the larger, producing and collecting cases for me. As I said before, they just allowed me to do what I had always done. And indeed, that's the way it worked out, because over the 3 years that I've been there, my productivity is pretty much similar to the way it was before I left.
Right. And it ended up being really fortunate in your situation, because you really didn't even have the conversation about what your post-closing life was going to look like with them, but it worked out very well.
I don't think I was intelligent enough to understand that at the time. I mean, I knew what the physical facility was going to be like,
Right.
but I think it's really difficult to understand on a day-by-day and hour-by-hour basis what your life is going to be like,
Right.
Dr.
Auerbach, just staying on this theme of challenges, if you can think back when you were looking to sell your practice, what do you recall? What challenges? What could what you would have done differently, if anything at all?
Yeah, for me, it was an interesting time because we had built a lot of infrastructure we had 11 offices and we had created our own DSO that we had built without any outside investors. We did it all through commercial lenders. At the time, money was really cheap and easy to get through TD Bank, and they were very helpful. They saw that time and time again we were building successful practices, so they were just as happy to give us the money. And so I had built a DSO with a fair amount of infrastructure. This is maybe different than a lot of people's experience here, which ended up costing me essentially in terms of my enterprise value, because there was so much cost, so much money that I was spending on an annual basis that my EBITDA was lower than it should have been relative to what my revenue was, or what my collections were. And so that for me was a major learning process. It all worked out beautifully, but the fact is I had to kind of figure that out. To speak about not knowing, the concept is there's so much out there that you don't know because you're not on the other side, and we are constantly learning. I am constantly learning where I am. It's like you kind of don't know what you don't know, and you got to do as best as you can. There's a ton of information out there. There are a ton of resources. People like Mark and Casey and this entire room is filled with people who actually have experience in this. And so I think it behooves you to speak to as many people as you possibly can to get as much information, to learn as much about the potential buyers. Do you want to sell to a DSO? Do you want to partner with existing practices? Do you want to go multi-specialty or single specialty or general? There's just so many different ways of going about it. And again, like anything else, and I've repeated this now a few times, it's really about who you end up kind of partnering with that will define how happy you are after the deal. Because ultimately, the money differential, everyone's basically within a small space of one another, right? I mean, half a turn, whatever it is. Ultimately, the right move is to find the people that you're most comfortable with. Speak about vibrations. I mean, I speak about vibes all the time. You have to have the right vibes. I mean, that's what it is.
Jason, to follow up on that, you said you didn't build too much infrastructure. How could you have not?
I had to, but I had purchased a few practices in the years immediately right before we transacted that were
Months,
not yet
in the months immediately before.
that were not ramped to their levels. So at that time, DSOs, private equity, were really counting significantly the pro forma, the go forward, and paying on that. Things have changed a little bit to some degree. But we were able to create earnouts that we actually, hit and have enjoyed the benefits of. But
I mean, you structured.
I hired, like, for example, I hired a CO. So I had a bunch of practices. I actually needed a director of operations, of clinical operations, but I didn't know that that's what it was called, so I looked for a COO. So I hired this company to find me a COO. Guy is amazing. He's our current COO at Max now, but he cost me a fair amount of money on an annual basis, which was a direct line item against EBITDA. So having him in my organization, who was instrumental in me actually getting through the process, but he cost me millions of dollars. Yeah, millions of dollars. And so ultimately he will, and he's already, it's been great. But the fact of the matter is, in terms of if you just look at the value at sale, it cost me money. I wouldn't have been able to do it without him, and I couldn't do it without him now, but it cost me money.
Talk about an associate and the value of the associate versus versus his salary.
Yeah, I mean, so when you just say, when you hire an oral surgeon, it's pretty costly, and then you have to hire full-time employees around that doctor. There's marketing around that doctor and all of that, and ultimately, unless you have a very, very significant backlog of patients that's insurance-based that don't care if they see you, then you have a situation where that doctor costs you money initially. Having an associate, anyone who has had an associate here knows that, many of them can be helpful for you, but oftentimes they cost you money, especially in the early years. And so there's something to be said about that. In terms of transacting, in terms of being the owner who has 100% or some large percentage of the ownership situation, you have to have the associate believe that what you're doing, know that what you're doing, and buy into what you're doing is right for his or her career going forward. Because your practice is worth only what is being done. I talk about, like, we as the dentists are the talent, right? We as the clinicians are the talent. A lot of people who have a business, manufacturing, frozen foods, whatever it is, you could sell your business and you could walk away, or you're essentially irrelevant. Your goodwill is everything in terms of the value of your practice. So too is that of the associate, especially if he's been or she has been there for an extended period of time. So the associate's buy-in is tremendous.
From the buyer's point of view, how they view the associate that's not producing.
Oh, that's not producing?
Well, that's costing you money because it's ramping up.
Well, so, I mean, if you can prove that you've ramped associates in the past, then there's value to that. I mean, you have to believe that if he's growing, you got to look at the TTM and you got to look at the previous time and your history. If an associate is costing you money, I mean, at some point you got to look at, is the associate worth it?
Yeah.
I would just make a comment to dovetail on.
From the buyer's point of view.
But I would just make it from.
How do you value the practice if there's an associate on board?
So the practice is valued at some sort of, as you know, some sort of a multiple against the profitability, EBITDA, of the practice, right? So if the associate is contributing to the revenue of the practice and to the EBITDA of the practice, that's weighted just as much so long as you can retain him. We encourage our selling or our partnering doctors to distribute equity to that doctor, to the associate, so that associate can be just as immersed in the concept as the previous owner was.
As a general rule, I would say, though, that DSOs are more attracted to practices that have an associate because they want to see that you actually have an internal succession plan. Because if you don't have an associate there, they're going to have to go out and hire someone, and then there may or may not be that opportunity to train them and transition them properly. So, you kept saying like underperforming. Well, if you have an underperforming anyone, they probably won't be there very long, and they shouldn't be. But if you've just hired someone and they're ramping up, that's part of doing business, and they are going to be more attracted to the fact that you actually have an associate. It is a good thing, because associates, as a rule, should add revenue to the practice.
Yeah.
That's under contract, too.
Under
Five
contract.
months into the thing is not.
Yeah, so there's
Yeah,
a run
that's
rate that you can
different.
figure
Yeah,
out.
that's a run rate.
And then you
Yeah.
build in an earn out theoretically if that was what it was. But yes, not only
As
just.
opposed to just cutting off the associate when, you know.
No, she's 100%
Yeah.
right. I mean, we want also the spread of the risk concept. God forbid there's something were to happen to you or something like that. There was somebody who could actually take the reins and actually perform the procedures. So there's absolute value. There's absolute value in greater number of surgeons. I mean, for sure, or doctors.
Andre, I was going to say what Dr. Sorin and Jason did, and every business owner has done, and I mentioned it before. As entrepreneurs, it's all about guesses and bets. And so I think that the rule of thumb should be this, and I try to keep it as simple as possible. There's two things. There's expenses and there's investments. If you're an expense, you should always be on the chopping block. So if that was an expense, you don't want any expenses.
Yeah.
That's why it's guesses and bets.
We don't know.
Yeah.
But I think that what I think you should have is an unlimited appetite for investment, as long as you can get at least a 4 or 5 to 1 return on your money. And so part of that is, and that's why you want the right team around you. That's why you want to make the right guesses and bets and make educated decisions. But I would also say that for every one of us who've been in business a long time, we've guessed wrong. But had we not done a couple of things that didn't work, we probably wouldn't have done a couple of other things that helped make us millions of dollars going forward. And I think that's part of the guesses and bets that anybody has that owns their own business. But you have to make educated decisions, and you have to do it with great information, and you have to make sure that you have a high probability of success. And that's how people create wealth
Yeah.
and great practices.
And I also think that, again, coming from, there's a couple different buckets, right? Like Casey was saying, you have your solo to solo, and then you have your DSO type of acquisition, but you also have emerging groups, or you have regional DSOs. And so when we take a look at things, that's part of that transition planning and the compilation, right? Because we're doing all that data gathering in the beginning. Then we're sitting down and we're having a need conversation. We're talking about what are the dynamics of those associates in the practice? How do they come into play? What's their compensation? Do you have a contract with them? What are some of the other things? How long have they been here? How long are they willing to stay? So all of those things are part of that sitting down and need process before we even get to that point. But having that discussion, and when I look at an associate and we're taking a look at, what days a week do they work, one of the things that always comes up, well, if the associate's in the practice, how come the associate's not buying the practice, right? And so sometimes we have to have a conversation around, why is that associate not buying in? Now, that associate may not be ready to, but that could also look as an opportunity for a DSO to say, okay, well, if they're young and they want to maybe get an equity into the practice, but they're not ready to acquire a practice, then we can do some type of carve out in there. So when we're sitting down and we're talking a lot about that, we are looking at what do they produce, how long have they been there, but also what are their goals and how does that fit in with the buyer, whether or not that's an emerging group or a DSO, just as important as a succession planning for that doctor when that doctor is selling, where maybe that doctor is going to look at selling to a DSO. And again, to us, we're representing the seller, and the buyers come in all different shapes and sizes, right? And so when that seller is looking to transition out, we're also taking a look at it and say it's a DSO that's coming to the table. We're sitting there and saying, okay, well, is that doctor the majority of the revenue producing income out of that practice? And where are they at in their phase of their career, how long they want to stay on? So all those components come into play. But regardless, it's a matter about setting your goals in place first and then kind of working backwards from there.
Any other questions? I mean, we've thrown a lot at you. Yeah, please.
Just, throwing on a different concept. a lot of concepts, and Jason mentioned about how hiring the CEO costs you millions of dollars, but also help make the sale possible. So could you talk a little bit about approaches to valuation, small practice sale versus DSO type of sale, and then how people can avoid the mistakes that lead to destroying value toward the tail end of the career, and can help them grow value in the final year or two before they sell the practice.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much that can be done to find efficiencies in your practice. If you just look at like line item by line item on your P&L, there's you'll find unbelievable ways of saving money without decreasing the patient experience in any real way whatsoever. Just in terms of suppliers, renegotiating contracts, both with insurance companies and your vendors and things like that. Credit card processing, just little things. Scraps make a pile. And so if you're really kind of preparing for sale and you've got a 3-year horizon where you at that point are going to sell and then work for another 3 to 5 years, you definitely have to be thinking in terms of kind of becoming a little bit more lean. But also for me, my whole philosophy has always been patient care first. I mean, it's like the cornerstone of what Max is all about. Really, we have a clinical advisory board that is autonomous and independent and is all about everything delivery of care. We focus on that. The finance guys focus on the finance. And so the fact of the matter is that the patient care piece has to come first. That's not rhetoric. That's not bullshit. That is absolutely our focus. And I assume for most of us in this room who are healthcare practitioners, we feel the same way. This is not like some novel concept. But the fact of the matter is like what you can do to set yourself up to have the most valuable practice. It's the finance guys, if it's a DSO kind of thing or a direct private equity kind of thing, the finance guys are very simple. It's all quant. They're looking at a multiple based on risk, based on a whole lot of little factors against your EBITDA. That's what it is. I mean, we could talk about all of the qualitative stuff and all of that, but that's how finance people look at it. They're looking at numbers. There's some color that can give you like a 0.1 of a turn or 0.2 of a turn, but ultimately there's a valuation that they perceive is within their risk tolerance, and that's how they're going to value your practice. We all value our practices like, well, I'm the guy who's known for this or that or whatever. I'm loved in my community, and people know that they can trust me, and I've got all 589 5-star reviews and all that stuff, and that's important, but it's not the way that the finance guys are going to look at the numbers. They look at the numbers. So we are essentially in a disadvantage because most of us look at the numbers in those contexts. We're like, if you make enough money to not worry about making enough money, you're being successful for the most part. That's how I was, really. And so you got to up your game in terms of the education involved in what they're looking at. Understand the way that they're going to look at it so that you can actually provide to them what they want. Make it nice and pretty, and ultimately use people who are going to be helpful to you and advise you appropriately to do it the right way. Attorneys, accountants, advisors, everyone. You have a team of people. You have a coach who's going to teach you how to swing well or hit the ball or whatever it is. You have people who know. It's all they do, so they know it well.
I think there's a really important distinction that Jason touched upon. I just wanted to kind of clarify it for everybody. He's talking a lot about EBITDA and multiples and profitability, which are all DSO concepts because they come out of the private equity world. And for those of you who don't speak in acronyms, EBITDA stands for earnings before income, taxes, depreciation, and amortization, which really doesn't mean much more than the acronym, but essentially it's a pure measure of the profitability of your firm. So you take the gross revenue and you strip out all of the expenses that are legitimate expenses, and you add back your taxes, interest, and depreciation, and that gives you a measure of the profitability. And that's what DSOs base their purchase price on. The difference is that in a doctor-to-doctor sale, whether it be you're selling your entire practice to the people across the street or whether you're selling a portion of your practice to an associate, that is most likely not going to be based on EBITDA. It's going to be based on a historic formula that's been around for longer than I've been doing this, which is 17 years, and that's based on collections, which is something that we can all do ourselves, right? So it's really important when you're thinking about your exit strategy to kind of analyze, are we going to be doing a DSO type transaction, or are we going to be doing a doctor-to-doctor transaction? If you happen to be doing a doctor-to-doctor transaction, the kind of standard formula is that you look at the weighted average of your gross collections over the last 3 years. And what I mean by that is you go back and look at last year, the gross collections, multiply it by 3. Look at 2 years ago, multiply it by 2. Look at 3 years ago, multiply it by 1. Add all those together, divide by 6. That's the weighted average of your gross collections. And then you multiply it by somewhere between 60 to 100%, depending on how beautiful your practice is and how special you are. You're all sellers in the room, it's 100%. You buyers in the room, it's 60%. It's all perspective. And so I just wanted to kind of point out that juxtaposition between private sales versus DSO sales, because when you're talking about a DSO sale, the profitability matters. So the fact that he hired a COO, that mattered. It attracted the DSO to him, but it also cost him money. If you're selling in a doctor-to-doctor sale, your expenses don't really matter in terms of your purchase price and your valuation, because the new owner is going to do whatever they want to do with expenses. So one of the great things that you can do if you're thinking about selling is to make sure you have a dental-specific accountant. Not your neighbor's brother's ex-boyfriend who you had, or your friend from law school, or I guess I was also your friend from dental school who had a brother, or what. Like, it's always somebody, family member, who they feel like they owe it to. Look, you're an entrepreneur. You don't owe anybody anything. Go out there and hire the best dental-specific accountant you can find. And I'll plug LLI because they're amazing. But, the thing you can do is you can call Dominic and you can say, I'm thinking about selling. I'm thinking about selling to in a private sale. Can you help me figure out what it's worth? Or can you help me figure out what I can do to make it be worth more? And so I always say, like, if you have your own little board of directors, the most important person on your board of directors is your accountant, because they're kind of the backbone for the entire financial decision-making board. And knowing what you're worth before you start having conversations is incredibly important and incredibly valuable. And, since I had the pleasure of representing both Jason Auerbach and Dr. Sorin in their transactions, I can tell you that they both knew what they were worth before.
Who is easier to work with? No.
No comment.
Definitely not.
Definitely not Dr. Auerbach.
Yeah.
It's been 16 years. We're not firing each other. No, but I just think it's important that you realize that there's really two different schools of thought when it comes to valuation, and one is based on profitability and one is based on gross collections. So just knowing where you're headed will be important in helping you decide how you're going to increase that.
Can I just
Sure,
ask
go
one
ahead.
question of that about that? So I'll give this background, and then I'll ask you the question. So obviously, for the first 10 or 11 practices that we partnered with, we did it that way, right? So we would look at the practice 3 years average and give them, whatever, 50 to 75% actually at the time. What percentage of practice transactions now are doctor to doctor versus DSO, and how much has that how much has the DSO private equity involvement in practice acquisition affected the ability of the doctor to buy another doctor's practice? Because the values probably, I assume, I've seen them inflated relative to what they were.
So I think I recently did a speaking engagement, and I labeled it "DSOs are not taking over the world." And so I think what becomes very difficult, especially in our market, is that a few years ago, it seems like there was no DSOs that were here. So certainly it's evolved and it's come pretty fast and furious, right? But I would say, again, going back to representing sellers, and the one thing that I would always say is no matter what, just make sure that you don't take that unsolicited phone call. Make sure that you have representation and have somebody on your side that's really going to look out for your best interest, because the DSOs are going to, give you a proposition or talk to you about some things, and then there's some underlying things that are going to be built into that. That would be my number one. So whether it's me or somebody else that is a broker helping you represent your best interest in mind, make sure you're well represented. The other thing I would say is what's difficult to kind of understand is they were baby DSOs at some point in time, right? And now they may be larger DSOs. But their business models and their representation and what they're looking for has evolved significantly, especially over the last 5 years. And so that DSO that might have been 4 locations that was okay with 3 operatories in a house doing $600,000, their now minimums might be somewhere around $1.5 million. And I think that's what's important. I like to say sometimes my ear is too much to the ground, but we know who those contenders are, and we're having conversations about how they evolve, how they've changed. But ultimately, I would say, out of 580 transitions that we did nationwide, still even DDS match nationwide, representing doctors, is about 13% nationwide that went to a DSO. So we're still a lot of doctor to doctor or doctor to multi-doctor as opposed to DSO.
And the other thing I wanted to add to that is that, and then there's a question in the back, Katie. The interesting situation when it comes to DSOs as buyers versus private doctors as buyers is that DSOs have entire boards of finance people just sitting around crunching numbers and analyzing things. And it's a lot of red tape. And so if the EBITDA doesn't fit within this very strategic model, then they're going to pass on the practice. Doctors can go out and buy practices with very little red tape. You can literally go to Provide and show them the balance sheet and tax forms for the last 3 years, and Provide's going to be like, rubber stamp, here's 100% financing. And that's it. They don't care about the EBITDA. So I think because we live in a world where there's fee-for-service practices, okay, your credit has to be at least decent. But, we live in a world where there's always fee-for-service practices, and because that we're never going to be fully saturated by, private equity the way the medical space is, and because it's so easy to borrow money if you're actually a licensed doctor going to be working in the practice, that I don't really see it slowing down. We had this huge boom of DSO transactions in 2020 and 2021, and then as soon as the interest rates start to creep up, they all got scared, and all of my private buyers came out of the woodwork, and they're like, let's go. So, I think they play off of each other, and everything is cyclical. We're in a DSO-driven market at the moment, but that happened in the 90s, and it totally crashed, and, it's just going to go full cycle again. But if you are someone in this room thinking about selling to a private practitioner or thinking about buying a private practice, don't worry. There's plenty of inventory and plenty of availability to do that.
So my credit score of 500 is not great.
That's probably not going to work out.
We'll work on that.
Well, if you put 90% down.
Kind of graded as needs improvement.
I got a guy in Jersey who can.
So my question might be a little self-serving on this one, but very interested in the board's approach to this. So I'm in technology, so I'd wonder, how do your conversations in regards to EBITDA and the technology they invest in play into how does someone, A, grow their business, and then B, how does someone who's looking to have an exit strategy still look to make investments of that makes them more appealing to companies? So if you have someone who has one business who wants to acquire another 10, to look at the systems and technologies that sees it's closer in line with what they're using. So that aspect is something I've always been very interested in, and especially with the dentist practice of how they look at that part. Because when I look at a practice, I don't just look at the doctor, I look at what's their gross volume per employee is the metric that I typically look at a practice, to look at its health, to see where we can help it grow, expand, and every part of that. So if they're too low, we can see the numbers are thin, that they might need improvements. If it's high, that's great. Everyone wants that. If you have $350,000 per gross employee per employee, that's great. But if you're at $200,000, somewhere in there, how do you help that business grow through technology? And how do you look at, is that something that's worth acquiring and developing? Or where do you look at that aspect of it?
I would make an argument that I'll not only take technology, that I think that the only way you can leverage and scale is with technology, and that's not only the latest equipment, being able to be CIRAC, to do all the latest and greatest, using artificial intelligence in your business. And I think that everybody should be a marketing company first, a technology company second, and then the other things third. I used to think that when someone tells me that we get all of our new patients from referrals and introduction, what that usually tells me is that their patients really like them. They even may love them. But it also tells me they're growing very, very slowly. So it's not what you know or who you know. That's all true. But it's who knows what you know. And you just need a lot more people, a much bigger funnel of people who know what you know to be able to grow at a rapid pace. And I think they kind of cross-collateralize in the sense that being a marketing company first is, to me, is paramount. But then the second thing is you can use technology and to be able to leverage and scale. I don't see how you can do it other ways. You're not going to just throw more bodies at the problem or overhead. That's the only way any business can grow, much less a dental practice. I'd love to hear what the doctors, what they think about technology.
Well, I think that I think one of the problems that we face is the cost of technology right now. And certainly, when I was a solo practitioner, it was getting to a point where the cost of technology was consuming large amounts of my overhead costs. And I couldn't grow the practice fast enough to overcome some of that adversity. So one of the things that I'm happiest about right now is I don't need to worry about that. So I think there are others on this panel who can address that issue a little better than
What do you worry
I can.
about? What do you do for aggravation?
I play golf.
I will say on the buy side, since I do represent Max, that I'm very involved in the due diligence process when we're acquiring practices. A practice that has invested in technology and has the latest and greatest of anything, whether it be their marketing system or that maybe the level of equipment that they have in the office. Those practices are going to be getting a slightly higher multiple of EBITDA, meaning a higher purchase price than a practice that has shag carpet and paper files. On the private side in doctor-to-doctor sales, it's the same thing. I talked about this kind of range from 60 to 100% of gross revenue. The 60% is like the retiring doctor who's going to not stay on, no transition, and has dated equipment and dated technology. The 100% are the people that you're walking into the Apple store and you're going to be in this pristine environment. So I do think technology is important. I think technology is a symbol of trust in this generation. And without it, you're kind of dead in the water for the next generation of patients.
Yeah, let me speak a little bit to that. When we look at practices, technology reinvestment in the practice is tremendously important. Personally, to me, when I'm looking at a practice, the more progressive the practice, the more invested they are in technology. Generally speaking, the more successful the practice is. I mean, you could see a direct correlation. We also look at EMR. We look at like the cohesiveness of their tech stack, and we think about those things completely. We don't not acquire practices that that are on different EMRs, but now as we are coming to our 30th location, we think a lot about whether or not we're going to bring the EMR to one actual one situation. If you're cloud-based, if you're server-based, what your phone system is. I mean, there's a bunch of stuff that goes into it, not just the patient-facing technology, which is also tremendously important. And this is from a sell-side perspective. When you're doing your due diligence on whoever you might be partnering with, look at what they've done and what they continue to do with the practices with whom they've already partnered, because realistically speaking, that's what they're going to do with your practice. So this is not a Max ad, but if you look at us, we're currently building out an office in a location of ours. We're investing a ton into the space, a ton into the technology, which is all CapEx, by the way, different than EBITDA, different. Speaks to cash flow, but not so much profitability as it relates to valuation. But the fact of the matter is that you have to look at what's been done in the past, because that is generally a marker of what you can expect. It's not a guarantee, but it is certainly, what you can expect.
No, I think we're gonna. Sure, go ahead.
Casey,
So you're talking about the two valuations. What do they look like usually in terms of what does the EBITDA times multiple versus
Yeah, I
Gross.
understand what you're saying.
that's number one. Number two, I was in another lecture where somebody suggested that DSOs are looking to make their money back in 5 years. And if you look at your own cash flows, you stay in the business for 5 more years, you'd probably even with where you are, and if you stay past that, you're going to make more money than selling. So can you address those two questions?
Yeah, I'll answer the first one. The second is the Mark Murphy question. So the first question is, I'm just going to give you ballpark because every deal is different. The EBITDA structure is different. How they even define EBITDA is different, and the multiples are different. But generally speaking, when you're talking about a multiple of EBITDA, it's going to look something like 100 to 120% of the gross revenue. So as a general rule, an offer from a DSO is going to be higher than a private practice type offer. That's kind of just the general rule. The difference is that many of the private practice deals would never attract a DSO buyer. And many of the DSO deals that are being done could never be paid for by one single private practitioner because they wouldn't necessarily be able to get that much financing. They're over the limits, whatever. Most lenders have a cap. It's usually like $5 million. Do you have a cap?
Not for transaction, usually for like household.
Okay. So most of the time when we're talking about, this versus that, there's not really two options on the table once we do the analysis. You're either going to go the DSO route because of the size that you're at. Like Jason never could have sold to a private doctor. No individual could have borrowed the money to pay that price. But he had to go the DSO private equity route. But if you have a smaller practice, you may or may not be attractive to a DSO. The DSO will likely, if you have two options, the DSO will likely be the higher offer, but it's going to come with the stipulations of you're not getting 100% cash at close, you're probably getting 70% cash at close, and there's going to be the required work back. So the private offer will probably be more cash at close. So we just have to kind of weigh the pros and cons of what it is that you're looking for in your specific offer.
I'm not pro or con DSO. I think there's room for both people.
Yeah.
But ultimately, I think that your culture will eat strategy for lunch every day of the week. And what you want to do is take the best of what people do in the DSO market and add that with your culture, and it's a powerful team. And remember, the very essence of mergers and acquisitions is driving multiple streams of revenue through one stream of fixed overhead, through economies and efficiencies of scale. Let me give you an example. When you have 50 practices, immediately you're going to see probably a 10 to 15% increase at a minimum from the dental reimbursements from what that private practitioner is getting. So if you have somebody that's doing $3 million, the next day, if it was an all insurance practice, that practice will be collecting almost $3.5 million doing the same work you did the following year. They're buying differently. In fact, one of the companies, one of the many dental private equity companies we founded was a company called True Blue, which was trying to give private practitioners the ability to buy in bulk, be able to negotiate in bulk, and be able to not only survive but thrive with the big folks. And so part of that is you can go point by point by point in terms of how they have that competitive advantage. It's no different than Home Depot versus a local hardware store. But I still think there's room for us to beat them. Everybody has a place to go do that, but you have to have the strategy and techniques and the right people around you to help you to win the game. And it's doable, but most people aren't that. Most people are not at 9 o'clock at night on a Wednesday night at a lecture. They're playing pickleball tonight, or they're curling up watching Netflix on TV, and those people are getting swallowed up by DSOs and taking their life's work and turning it away for pennies. And so, but there's a path there for folks like the folks in this room.
I think we have this room for another 10 minutes, 15 minutes. So why don't we end it here? Thank our panels for a great discussion that we had. And then,
Can we get one more question from this young man?
but one more question? Sure, go ahead.
Different perspective.
All right. All right.
First, I just want to thank all you guys for coming out and sharing this wisdom. It's really invaluable.
Casey's married, so she's not available.
Yeah, so I have a question for Dr. Auerbach, the legendary bloody tooth guy amongst our student cohort. If you were to go back, as a young surgeon, young dentist, how would you navigate this DSO space? What do you think would, to have the same opportunities you felt that you had when you first started, what would you do now in this kind of space with DSOs having the presence that they have?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I speak to a lot of young people. I appreciate the love, but I would say this. When I was starting out, I finished dental school in '99. I finished training in '03, and at that time I was working in mills, Medicaid mills, and I was seeing a ton of patients in the Bronx or upstate New York or down South Jersey, and I was getting my speed up, and I was understanding how to deal with people, human beings, how to interact with referring doctors and parents and kids and all of it. I was just kind of honing my humanity, which is what you do when you're just out, right? You'll have the technical skill set when you come out of dental school or residency or whatever, and then you really have to figure out how to interact with human beings in a professional sense. And that's the early years. And frankly, you guys have the benefit of, if you want to, and you're entrepreneurial, you have the benefit of kind of using the DSO world, right, to make fair amount of money. Most people here would say these DSOs are paying a lot of money to young people who don't necessarily have the acumen yet, respectfully, to do the work that you learn over 20, 30, 40-year career. So you have the ability to really get out there, earn a good living on someone else's dime, and hone your skill set, find your passion, if you will. I totally agree that the opportunity is still ripe. If you want to start something and you want to take that risk, you do have to understand, though, that a lot of stuff that you see from people later on in their career, you don't see the years of struggle and what was done and all of that to kind of get there. And it's not always beautiful like it is on Instagram. The fact is that if you're driven and you get a little lucky and you build a team of good people around you who can guide you and help you even when things get really tough, you can build anything that any one of us in this room have built. That is a fact. So I think it's different. It's tough in some ways. It's easy in some ways as well. But anything ultimately worth having is worth busting your ass for. So I think you're in a good situation. I don't think it's as like doom and gloom as you probably hear from, I don't know where you guys are in school or anything like that, but some of the dental school instructors or people who have been there like long for the olden days and stuff like that. I mean, everyone wants like a simpler time, but the fact is you have a tremendous opportunity ahead of you. You're in an incredible profession. Dentistry, surgery, specialty dentistry, whatever it is great. You get to go to work every single day, help people, interact with different people who are going to tell you how good you are. Oh my God, that was great. I was scared shitless and now I feel good. I mean, it's really special stuff. So just be confident that you're in the right situation, that you made the right decision. Even your friends who are in PE and VC and whatever they're in, they're making a shit ton of money now. But the fact of the matter is you're going to have a career that you can be proud of long term. So,
Jason, I would say this to them. I think there's room for both people. If you have an entrepreneurial bone, it's almost impossible to create multi-generational wealth with a salary. Even if you make $1 million a year, in New York, half of that goes to the government. And by the time you pay your rent or your mortgage and, take a vacation or buy a pair of sneakers or something and you put a few bucks away, how are you going to be worth $50, $100, $200 million in that place? There's no way. The only way you can do it is your money has to work while you sleep and your business has to create revenue without you doing the do. And so for somebody that's entrepreneurial, I think the DSOs will pay a slight premium in the beginning to suck your dreams away. And you're like hooked on the drugs, and that's great for a lot of people because not everybody's entrepreneurial. But if you guys want to follow the path of the two guys on this panel and a lot of other people that I know in this room, you guys, I think everyone on this panel would wish we were where you are right now, knowing what we know right now. And so you guys, your future is incredible.
And I would say that, part of my best conversations are having discussions after you've kind of gotten out there and gotten your hands wet and worked for a DSO or a high volume practice. And have the conversation of a potential buyer coming in and saying, okay, I've been thinking about this. What does it look like for me? What type of practices are out there? How do you help create those spokes on the wheel? I would say continue to stay actively involved, and kudos to you guys for coming to an event like this, because I think the more that you network and you stay involved and speak to lenders and all of us in the community, the entrepreneurial spirit is one thing, but making sure you have an arsenal of people behind you. Advice is free, so make sure you utilize the resources that are available.
Appreciate it. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, guys.